social studies curriculum. So with that, I will proceed. I'm going to be maskless, mainly because I don't have a microphone, and I'll try to speak loudly enough so that you can hear every word I'm saying, or not. Okay, critical race theory. It's in the news a lot. You can't turn on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or go through the news feed on your cell phone lately without coming across this topic. It's not news in Chenango County. I think it will be for reasons that I'll talk about. Okay, so critical race theory, historian's appraisal. I'm the historian. Here we go. Now that's a lot of stuff up there. It's a monster. To read about critical race theory, it's like trying to read Karl Marx's Kapital or Hitler's Mein Kampf. It's dense, it's hard. It's like reading John Locke's 2 treatises on government. It's tough stuff. Those are the tenets. I'm not going to pretend to go through every one, except to say that it's micro level stuff. If you're looking at an oil painting and you're up too close and you see the brush strokes and the points of color, you don't understand it. You've got to stand back from an oil painting to understand the holistic, what the artist wants to show you. I submit this is the same thing. There's a lot of micro level stuff in here that's enormously difficult to process and understand. It is not anything that is designed to denigrate white people. You may hear the word white privilege on the news. That doesn't mean that people like me and most of you in here are privileged in any way. What it means is that if you're white, you enjoy the privilege of not being structurally compromised or impeded or stopped from doing things in our society. That's what it means. That's a part of this, but it's not denigrating white people. So critical race theory. I'm a reductionist. I like to get down to the essence of things, what's important. Here's what I think is important about critical race theory. The core of this is that it's a social construct. That our society, from its earliest origins, is structured to be racist. That's the core theory. There's a corollary to this, that individuals are biased. That many individuals in our society throughout our history have also been biased. So these are complementary. They're not contradictory. They overlap, they're complementary. There are structural parts of our history that are racist. There are individuals in our society who are racist. And it's easy to overlap them. Come on in, there's lots of chairs here. Don't be afraid to walk up. Okay, at 40 years, it starts off as a predominantly Afro-American, Black American endeavor. And the literature uses these words, spin-offs and splintering. So this kind of stuff talks about spin-offs and splintering. And you can see what's happened to it. It has become inclusive. It's become distributed. It's not simply Black Americans. It's LGBT, it's Muslims, it's Native Americans. I would add to this, it's not in the literature, but I would add anti-Semitism to this list, because I think that's something that surely we can include as well. So that's critical race theory in a nutshell. Structural challenges and obstacles and individuals. All right, the books. The origins of the theory. Lawyers write this. Think about that. Lawyers write it. Okay. The origins are all about case law and how lawyers interpret the problems that minorities have in our country. So its origins are judicial. It then takes off and it's acquired by educators. And there's a whole literature about how to include this in educational systems. If you've heard that critical race theory is communist, it's not. But if you read the educational literature on the subject, what you will find is that the school of thought in America is different than the school of thought in the United Kingdom. the school of thought about critical race theory in the United Kingdom is strongly influenced by Marxism. Now, that's a dirty word, but what they're talking about in that school of thought is class struggle. They're not talking about taking your house and giving it to somebody who's not working. They're talking about the inherent nature of class struggle in human society that Marx writes about in the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto. So it's not communist, but a school of thought talks about class struggle. That's kind of an important point that's lost on a lot of the opposition. All right. You may have heard about this, the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's critical race theory repackaged by journalists. This is not a theory. What this is a curriculum addition that creates modules and classes and projects to help students, K12, understand critical race theory and, not critical race theory, but the structural issues in American history, and presenting a different side of many people that we would ordinarily admire. So why the hell does this matter? So what? Who cares? Who cares how it came to be? This is why it matters. It's all about the case study method. Now, most of you, almost everybody here has probably been to college, and you have sat in a seminar where you had case studies on something or another. It's a persuasive and compelling and fun way to teach a subject. But the problem is, it's a case study, and it's selected by the person who's giving the class, writing the book, organizing the content. So it matters because this is the case study. Case studies are used to train these fields. Lawyers, sociologists, political scientists, international relations specialists, anthropologists. This is a dense part of their preparation if they're going to become a working professional in that field. So what am I saying? That the people that produce this use the case study method. There's maybe 8 of them. Okay, so you pick 8 of them. You know, there's 8 of them in chapter 6 in this book. Not used to teach or to train a historian. We don't use this. We may have a class, a course in which there are some cases presented as background, as foundational material, but it's not used in a historical PhD program, not used. Why is that? It matters, because the historical method is different than the case study method. If you know about the scientific method, a preliminary research, a preliminary hypothesis, assembling the research, putting it together, formulating your hypothesis, constructing the antithesis, and then validating what you've done, that's this. So historians, in the pure form, are trained in the same methodology that scientists are. It's a different way of thinking about stuff. Why does it matter? This is the dilemma that we historians have. I might know the 8 cases, but what else is out there that I don't know about? That maybe disproves the cases. So we ask ourselves when we do research, what have I missed? What's the rest of it all about that I don't know about? Dead Karl. We affectionately know him in the profession as Dead Karl. If you know, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and it is the foundational book on economics. This is the foundational book on human conflict and the study of war. Clausewitz wrote on war in 1832, and then he died, and his wife published it. It's a sad story. But why do I bring it up? He was not a historian, but he used the scientific method. And this is what he said about war. He said, a general theory of war is impossible. It can never be imagined. It can never be proven because there are too many cases, and a general theory has to balance all the cases. He was a nut about the human condition. He maintained that we never know the whole story. that things that are crucial to the decision-making process are not part of the historical record. We, honest to God, to this day, don't know why. At 2 p.m. on the 3rd of July in 1863, looking up at Cemetery Hill, that Lee launches Longstreet's offensive that you know as Pickett's charge. We don't know why he made that decision. He didn't write it down. He died before he wrote memoirs. We refused to talk about the war after the war. So we just don't know. Clausewitz thought that was important. And he thought that the phrase he used was the unconscious mind. That humans make decisions. They do things not because they're rational or explainable, but because they're often illogical and emotional. That's the nature, it's part of the human condition. War is like that. War is not a rational act. Nations don't go to war. When we went into Iraq in 2003, that was an emotional, constructed case. It was not rational. All right. You've seen this before if you came to my previous lecture. That's an actual picture of Georg Harris. I love this. I love the picture because when you write history, it hurts your head because you never know the whole story. So here's what I would say. Leave history to historians. Critical race theory is not history. It looks like history. It can be presented as history, but it's not history. Now, this looks like history too, doesn't it? President Trump appointed a presidential commission. And the end state is to create a package of material that teaches patriotism to Americans, to young Americans. There are 16 people on the commission, only one of which is a trained historian. You know, by the way, that was a guy, a right-wing guy you see on Fox News all the time named Victor Hanson Davis, who among the professionals in the profession is kind of ostracized. Most of the people in the profession think he's too politicized. So that's not history either. If you read this, the title is eloquent in terms of the content. What about slavery? You open this up, it's only 17 or 18 pages. Slavery. What does this commission want you to know about slavery? They don't want you to know about the things I'm going to talk about in the lecture. They want you to know that in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the words in the Declaration of Independence mean that the framers, the writers of that, didn't want slavery. It's not about the Constitution. It's about the Declaration of Independence, which is a statement of principles. That's all. It has nothing to do with the United States. The United States comes into being as a result of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution, I used to tell 10th graders this, it's an operator's manual for a government. That's all it is. The Constitution tells you how to structure and operate the U.S. government. That comes into effect in 1789 as a result of the convention. So this is not history either. So let me talk a little bit about this. Is racism structural in America? This is at the heart of the argument about critical race theory. Why 1619? That's the point at which black slaves from Africa are introduced to the Jamestown colony, which is now switched over and understands the plantation economy needs laborers. To grow these kind of crops in 100-degree heat in Tidewater, Virginia, you need a lot of people, and they're probably going to die quickly, and it's hard work, and the colonists won't do it. So blacks become a commodity. They are the petroleum of 1619. Petroleum runs our industrial effort in America. They're a commodity. And that's why the 1619 project starts in 1619. It is structural. The Constitutional Convention. Now, they meet in Philadelphia in 1787, and some of the people who were there also were at the Declaration of Independence. Not everybody, and there are some newcomers, but this is a key moment in American history because it results in the 3/5 compromise. Everybody in America can vote. Well, kind of. Not women, not indentured servants, not American Indians, and it's certainly not blacks. But in the southern colonies, there were a lot of black slaves. And as a political move to balance power in the House of Representatives, they arrived at the 3/5 compromise. If you had 5 black slaves in your district, that counted as 3 white people for representation in Congress, in the House of Representatives. So 5 black slaves, they didn't get to vote themselves, but they were counted in terms of 3 for 5. And this is in the Constitution. This is amended later on, of course, but this is structural. This is structural. Jefferson David, or rather Thomas Jefferson, I talked about him previously. We buy this area from France in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. Well, it becomes part of the structural problem that we have in our country, because the initial line that delineated the North and the South, slaves, not slaves, the Mason-Dixon line, didn't go far enough west. So as we add states, there's a school of thought, and why did the Civil War start? Slavery was foundational, but it's about westward expansion. It's about, as we expand west, the southern slave-holding states do not have a prayer of equal representation if events keep going as they were progressing after 1820. That's the Missouri Compromise. And they extend that slave-holding line all the way to the southern border between Missouri and Arkansas. And the compromise is, well, Missouri is above the line, but we'll let it come in as a slave state. But below the line, that's forever, from now on, that's where slaves can be bought and sold. And that line is then extended theoretically across the country. You can see, you can look at that, and this is a sidebar. Who supported the Mexican War? Who supported the acquisition of Texas and New Mexico and California and Arizona and Utah and Nevada? Well, it wasn't the Boston Brahmins. It's the slave-owning plantation owners of the South, and you can see obviously why you would need that territory. That's a compromise. That's structural. You may have come across this. I had to read this as a freshman in college. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He talks about America is, relatively speaking, the most democratic country in the world. He's comparing it against the hereditary monarchies of Europe. Relatively speaking, the most democratic, a populist state in a way. It's the age of Jackson. But he makes a point that much of what we talk wasn't true in reality, but America is aspirational. That there are black slaves, there are immigrants with no rights, there are American Indians who have been moved to Oklahoma. I'm not going to go over much of this stuff. You know about Dred Scott. I'm making an assumption that if you're here, you're interested in the subject, so you know a lot about what I'm going to talk. That's John Brown, the famous raid in 1859. What you might not know about abolitionists is there's a flip side. All those people who wanted to free the slaves weren't necessarily interested in having them live next door and giving them voting rights. A huge percentage of abolitionists were members of this society, the American Colonization Society, headed up by Bushrod Washington, who's George Washington's nephew. And the idea is slavery is morally wrong. If you're a slave owner, you're morally corrupt. So we shouldn't have slaves. We should free the slaves. And we should send them back to Africa. And we create a country called Liberia, with its capital of Monrovia. It's America's first failed experiment in exporting democracy. You take Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, you can flash back to 1835. This didn't work out either for a lot of reasons, but it's not in the curriculum. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Kinda. Why did he delay on the proclamation, on the Emancipation Proclamation? Because he was a lawyer and he was concerned about property rights. If he frees an owner's slave in a secessionist state, does at some point the United States of America assume liability to reimburse the slave owner for his loss? He didn't free the slaves. After he's dead, the 3 amendments follow him under the Johnson administration and actually free and enfranchise blacks in America. Now, does that mean he's a bad guy? Does that mean he was he was pro-slavery. No, it means he was a creature of his time. It means he balanced the needs of the nation versus his view at the time of American law, based on primarily on Dred Scott. And he proceeded from there. If he had lived, maybe it might have been a different outcome. You know about this. You all know about Jim Crow. You know about lynchings. You know about the Ku Klux Klan. You know about the end of Reconstruction in 1877. It's a political move. And the Army of Occupation in the South comes back, comes home. So I'm not going to dwell on that. The 20th century is set up by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Separate but equal. Sounds good. Briefs easy, executes hard, as we say in the Army. Separate but equal set us up for all this stuff. Separate facilities, separate schools, separate buses, separate lunch counters. This is the story of the 20th century, and this is structural. You get on a bus and you're black in Birmingham, Alabama in 1950 and try to sit in the front, you're not going to make it out to the first stop. This is structural stuff. This is also structural. That's a movie scene from a movie about the Kennedy administration, but when John F. Kennedy, a popular figure in the literature of desegregation in our country, you may have seen posters that have John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King racked up one after another, kind of like a medieval triptych, if you will. Well, John F. Kennedy was okay with having all of the servants, all of the wait staff in the White House be black. Didn't seem to faze him. You know about discrimination in the American military, profoundly structural until 1948. Harry Truman finally has the guts to say we're going to integrate the military, and by God, the generals didn't want to do that. Jimmy Doolittle was one of the few American generals who thought that'd be a good idea. Most didn't. Jimmy Doolittle was not a West Pointer. He was an MIT graduate. Different guy. So that's also structural. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 should fix things. And it does, kind of. But there's a huge white reaction to the Civil Rights Act. Primarily, the Democratic South flips to become Republican. That's not structural, that's just a fact. But segregation academies, what they call seg academies, private schools for white kids, pop up all over the South. That book that I mentioned in the last lecture, Robert E. Lee and Me, there's 2 chapters on seg academies. It's fascinating. That's not Richie Cunningham and that's Alan Bakke, who failed to get into med school and took that case to court. Reverse discrimination. Structural. These are structural issues. The legislation doesn't fix what's wrong enough to where we end the problem. Today, this is probably why you're here. You're watching the news. You're watching blacks be arrested and wind up dead. You're aware that in some places in America, if you're black, you've got to wait 10 hours to vote. You don't have to do that here. I walk into St. Bart's and 10 minutes later I'm out. Doesn't happen to me. It happens a lot of places. That's Buffalo, New York. You ever heard about redlining? Redlining is a banking industry construct where black applicants for mortgages are not told up front you can't have a mortgage for that town, for that neighborhood, that house, but if it's in a red line neighborhood, you're not going to get a mortgage. That's structural. So what I've thrown out here are government, private, banking, societal obstacles, structural problems that initially blacks, and now you can add to it. You can add Muslims. You can add gays and transgenders that suffer under this in some places, not everywhere. I find this dangerous. There's similar to the 1970s. There's tremendous white backlash to critical race theory. This guy here, Christopher Rufo, he is the face of He's the Alan Baki of today, if you will. Only he publishes. This is Hillsborough College material. That's a lot like Liberty University, only worse in terms of its polarized, right-wing, arguably discriminatory agenda. That's Tom Cotton, who has tried to introduce legislation, federal legislation, that school districts can't teach critical race theory, or anything even like it. Josh Hawley signed on to that. Ted Cruz signed on to that. Chuck Schumer. I'm not throwing it out there, but what you're starting to see in some places in America is resistance. Signs like this. Say no. Stop teaching critical race theory. This is a .org website in Texas that will teach you how to recognize it. Now, you're not sitting in the classroom. But your sixth grader comes home from Michelle School down there at Perry Brown and says, you know, today we talked about multicultural competence. Or today, Rich Turnbull in the high school talked about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And today in the high school, Rich Bernstein was talking about Huck Finn and white privilege and prejudice and institutional racism. Your child comes home and tells you that bit of information. Now, you can take action. And this is all about taking action against critical race theory. So if you want to know how to recognize it, you can go on the internet, pull up, there's a number of sites. This is just one of a number. The bad news. The good news is we don't live in Texas. The good news is we live in New York State. Tell you a little bit about social studies. Let me go back to 2018. This is culturally responsive sustaining education framework. It's a guide. And what I like about it, it's got a glossary of terms. You want to know what racism is as a definition? Good place to find it. It's aspirational. Doesn't prescribe. Doesn't say it's got the school superintendent what he's got to do. It's aspirational. It stresses multicultural understandings and responses and culturally responsive information. I like to make things relevant, so I want to tell you a little bit about local history that you may not know. You may be sitting down there at Lindy's ice cream stand, and you're eating your little cone of whatever it is, and you look across the road to that red house, and there's that sign. You shake your head and say, I've seen that all my life. Me too. Who is that person? That's Ruth Benedict. One of the greatest anthropological, she's not a physical anthropologist, she was a cultural anthropologist. She was a pal of Margaret Mead, for God's sakes. Patterns of culture. The source of the term cultural relativity. That little red house down there by Lindy's ice cream stand. No society had a monopoly on the true and the right. I just throw that in there because these things aren't simply intellectual diatribes. They do have some relevance. Even this kind of stuff has some relevance, I think. What's going on today? There's a draft framework on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, that phrase comes right out of how do you fight CRT? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Your fourth grader hears that. Comes and says, Mom, what about diversity? Okay, what I like about this is it gives definitions. Beyond the glossary, there are broad definitions for larger topics. What does diversity mean? There's a paragraph about it. So I like that. It develops aspirations. It takes the aspirational and turns it into real world things you can do. It provides a shared common vocabulary. The part I like about it is it does not superimpose one culture over another. This is Ruth Benedict. No single culture is better than any other single culture. These are valuable things. What's the latest? There's the policy right there. It came out in May. The school district has to form a committee, and they're going to have to look at that question. They have to specifically acknowledge the role that racism and bigotry have played and continue to play in the American story. Should the English department read Huck Finn as an example? Should they read of mice and men? Should they read something else? So history, these things. It's not critical race theory. It looks like it doesn't denigrate white people. Unlike the previous stuff, this is prescriptive. This is highly prescriptive. This says school districts will do this and this and this. It tasks them to take concrete action. It tasks them to look at the curriculum. What I like about it is, as an historian, actively avoid the danger of the single story. That's a case study thing. If you're taking just one narrative, just one theme, and packaging it a certain way, you should probably stand back from that and look at the rest of it. Look at the whole part of everything else. So that's what's come down from the regions. Now, if I said to you, where would I put this in the curriculum? Most people are going to scratch their heads and say, well, not algebra. God, I can barely pass algebra anyways. How about social studies? And that's where most of you would put this. And with some benefit in the English. Ideally, when you're reading something in social studies, the English teacher is reading something similar. If you're doing the Spanish Civil War in history, maybe the English teacher ought to be doing For Whom the Bell Tolls, or something like that. All right, so there it is. There's the K12 curriculum on the right. And educators here will recognize, we talk about the curriculum spiral. We don't talk about race and diversity, for example, in every single grade. We talk about race and diversity, and these are broad themes. There are more, these are just some things I've kind of pulled out. Race and diversity, they hit it hard in kindergarten, first grade, third grade, and kind of in fifth grade. Gone after that. Doesn't really come back that way. Citizenship, we see it in some of the elementary classes. Now, then we kind of make this major jump to 12th grade. So the curriculum spiral reinforces pre-existing knowledge and understanding. You kind of remind students as you go up. Now, when they walk out the door in June as 12th grade graduates, do they remember it all? Probably not. They might remember some of it. Slavery, abolitionism, that comes in heavily in 7th and 8th grade. They will study the important Supreme Court cases in 11th grade. Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, the correctives of that, Brown versus the Board of Education, all that stuff. Korematsu versus the United States, all that stuff comes in 11th grade. 12th grade, it's back to participation in government, which is a half-year course. The second half-year course is economics. So that's the social studies curriculum. Now, the problem a guy like Rich Turnbull has, if he's teaching social studies like he is time. You've got 180 teaching days. Well, you crank into that 20 or 25 test days, and you crank into that review days, and you crank into that a day that's lost because there was a snowstorm and you have a short schedule. So now you've got about 150 days to get through all of this stuff. And the problem that guy like Rich Turnbull has is what can I teach? How much can I teach? What can I? It's not what to teach. No social studies teacher in New York State says, geez, what am I going to teach today? What should I teach tomorrow? What they wrestle with is what not to teach. I haven't got time to teach everything. So I've got to compress. I've got to pick and choose. I've got to do what's important. So it's a zero-sum game. Teaching is a zero-sum game. You're an educator, you're a teacher, you know what I'm talking about. Now, so where does the policy fit into Norwich City school districts? Well, let's say you were going to try to put this into social studies some way, somehow. You thought, okay, there's a problem. We aren't. Here, it's bigotry and racism in America. What's in the past? Easy. Go where we can find it. What's going on in America today? That's an opinion. That's tougher. So you're wrestling with that stuff to begin with. But where would you put it? I've got red lines there. Those red lines mean that the 7-8 course, which is a 2-year course, the 9-10 course, which is a 2-year course, and the 11th year course, these are pages and pages and pages of highly prescriptive material on what to teach. It is impossible. No social studies teacher in the state ever can do all of this. So there's no room. I'm here to tell you. They go to 7th grade until they come out at the end of 11th grade. There's no extra room for anything. So if you had a committee in the school district, you know, we really got to put this stuff in. Don't tell the teachers that. Tell them what to take out. They don't want to know what else to teach. They probably figured it out themselves. You have to tell them what to take out because there's not room for all of it. It's a dilemma. All right. I'm going to launch into just a few things that interest me as a historian that you don't ordinarily find in the social studies curriculum. What would I like to put in to illustrate the good parts and identify the flaws in our society? I start with the American Eugenics Society. They used to sterilize black people in the South involuntarily. To check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. Not just black people. Here's where the inclusion part comes in. They weren't just interested in American blacks. That was a part of it. That's the Carnegie Institute. We generally have a favorable notion about the Carnegie Institute. But they're quite interested in this phrase, pass for white, genetically and in terms of hereditary. You know, they didn't understand this in the 1920s. They didn't understand genes. They didn't understand RNA, DNA, any of that stuff. But they understood that if you blow, you know, that if you bred 2 black dogs, you're probably going to get a black puppy. Well, that theory was transposed erroneously in humanity. They were particularly concerned about the growing number of Americans that the state had to take care of in asylums for the disabled. If you're interested in knowing when Nancy Pelosi said the speaker, the minority speaker in the House, Kevin McCarthy, was a moron, there it is, mentally 10 to 12 years old. She tightly defined Kevin McCarthy. Now, heredity is a big problem. Home for the feeble-minded is, this is, you know, they didn't say the home for the disabled. The home for the feeble-minded is filled with those whose parents could not be, weren't as carefully selected as the dairymen. I mean, this is, I find this repulsive. You know about distance education. There's some guy in Cambridge, Massachusetts teaching you a class on your computer. You probably haven't heard about distant education. You may have heard of Jim Thorpe, the famous American Indian athlete who was from the Carlisle Indian School. Well, this is the Dawes Severalty Act and the Indian Schools Movement. Severalty, it's a word, I had to look it up when I came across it. It means to sever, to cut. The United States government, starting in the 1870s, and by act of Congress in 1887, comes up with an act that is designed to change the culture, the language, the religion, the way of life of the American Indians confined to reservations. There was an altruistic side to this. These are hunter-gatherers, and now they got to be farmers, so you've got to teach them. What's the best way to change in culture? Well, distant education means to take the influences, the sons and daughters of the chiefs, and the medicine men, and the shamans, and the elders of the tribe, take those children and take them to places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Distant education was just that. You put them on a train, 2,000 miles later in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they're shaking their heads, saying, I got Boujade, I know I've never been here before. And look at this. They all got a new name. I can't find how White Wolf got his, where the hell's that come from? Howard Chow? What? I don't know. But he's there for 5 years. Carlisle Barracks is the Army War College today. The Army War College used to have these pictures down every corridor. These before and after pictures. Never are they smiling. They're never smiling. Howard was a success. He graduated 5 years in the program, then went back to Lawton, Oklahoma. He became a translator for the Cherokee tribe with their interaction with the Indian agents. So he was a success. Here's some more. No smiles. Before and after. They go home, they're Christians, they're literate, they speak and read and write English, they have a skill. I think they're Navajo. You might know better than Nate. They kind of look like Navajo. They had the little dresses for the girls. I mean, they tried to recreate white men, and they were successful. You go out to the reservations of the West, you can't hardly find a person who speaks fluent Navajo. The last ones that could do it died. There were World War II veterans who translated for the Marine Corps on Okinawa. Again, this was successful. This is structural. This is structural. Did Hitler want to kill all the Jews? Well, that decision is not made until the Wannsee Conference in 1942. Up until then, he tried to get rid of them. And he tried to send them to countries, but they wouldn't take them. This is the famous ship, the St. Louis, leaves Hamburg with 937 refugees, Jewish refugees on board. They got lucky. The lucky ones got a visa. In August of 1939, the war starts in September. They get to Miami. The federal government won't let them off the boat. They go to Havana, can't get off the boat. They go to, I think it's Maracaibo or somewhere in South America, can't get off the boat. They go back to Hamburg just in time for the war to start. And what historians believe today is there are no survivors. There's only 937. We wouldn't let them in. Structural. Is it racism? They're Jews. They're Caucasians. It's bigotry. It's not racism. It's a case of structural bigotry. Now, we make up a little bit. This is a plus up. We gain 10. We do, in August of 1944, let in 982 refugees who go to Fort Ontario and Oswego. This is it. This is our sum total of Jewish refugees that we let in during World War II. It's structural. Now, why did we bring them in? It's a public relations effort on the part of the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. And the camps that were keeping them in Italy and in North Africa are full. So we've got some problems. We've got some surplus problems. Troop ship goes to Naples and drops off the 442nd DC Japanese Regiment full, comes back empty. Let's use those troop ships to bring some people back. We tried this once, and we stopped. It's a very, very sad story. It's structural. They're not black, they're Jews. And to make it worse, they're European, Eastern European Jews. They come from places like Minsk and Kiev and Riga. They weren't the Rothschilds from London. Structural. One of the words in the identification of critical race theory that I put up there, and you probably didn't catch it, is colonialism. Hot topic these days in history. Colonialism. This is the end of the war with Japan, what they call VJ Day. That's an officers' club. I think it's in Pearl Harbor. It's definitely in the Pacific. Those are Filipinos behind the bar. Now, why do I bring this up? We conquered the Philippines in 1898. They became an American territory. The Navy, the most profoundly racist of all of our services, used what they called Filipino mess boys. There was special legislation. Filipinos were not American citizens. It was a territory. It's like the Northern Marianas and Guam and Samoa. It was a territory. So these aren't citizens. But special legislation. If you join the Navy and I'm not talking about anything other than a waiter or a cook, and spent your tour of duty on Navy ships, you could become an American citizen. So this is a vestige of colonialism. The Philippines are independent until 1947. Now you would have thought, with desegregation of the military in 1948, that maybe this was gone. But the Navy liked it so much that they got Congress to pass special legislation in 1947 so that any Filipino citizen who was either in the service doing this already or wanted to join the service as an enlistee could legally sail on American Navy ships and become a citizen. So these are also forms of structural racism. I'm going to give you one case. I don't like case study. Is structural racism today? What would I say about it? Here's a fact. There's 4,252,000 plus or minus 10. I walk around with fingers that are American citizens but can't vote. Have no representation in Congress whatsoever. To make it worse, the guys from Samoa, they're not even U.S. citizens. They are in a peculiar category called natural Americans. They can apply for citizenship, but they aren't actually citizens. Puerto Rico. Let me just talk about Puerto Rico for a minute. World War I starts in April of 1917. That's when Wilson gets the Declaration of War. In March of 1917, the Jones Act is passed, which makes Puerto Ricans American citizens. Donald Trump in 2017 didn't really understand it, didn't really know they were American citizens. But they are as of March 1917. The war starts in April. The first draft occurs in May. And before we know it, before the summer's up, 20,000 Filipino men are en route to the United States Army as draftees. They can't vote. They're drafted. They're going to fight. 800 of them die in the war. That's structural racism. Now this is Ed's view. But it's hard for me to imagine in the year 2021 why America still has territories. You can make a constitutional case about the District of Columbia. But at the end of the day, they don't vote. They have kind of a sham ballot. They have a representative on the fringes of Congress who can visit, but they don't have the rights we do. All right, I told people I talked for about 50 minutes, and I'm on track here. I've gone through this fast. Is America a racist country by design? If you said to Thomas Jefferson, "Are you a racist?" he wouldn't understand that term. But we are a discriminatory country by design. We have discriminated throughout our history, not just to blacks, but to all of those groups, those splinter groups that I showed you earlier. American Indians, and gays, and transgenders, and Jews. This is our history. You can polish it up to teach patriotism, for example. You can polish it up to not teach the bad. Is that a good thing? My generation, I went to high school from 65 to 68. I can't tell you how many social studies discussions we had in the high school building with Walt Chinowski and Jim Teedy and Don Sherlin and others on things like desegregation and the war in Vietnam. Those teachers that I had in those days were more than willing to let us vent, talk, understand, and in those classes there was a population that thought the war in Vietnam was a worthy cause. There was a population that thought Felton morally wrong. I think I came out with a better word. So is America a racist country by design? I would say racist is the wrong word. I would use discriminatory. Is America a discriminatory country by design? I say yes. Does structural racism still exist in America today? Yes. I would also widen that, change the bandwidth. I'd widen the bandwidth, and I'd say structural discrimination does still exist in America today. I lived 8 years in Islamic countries in the Middle East. A lot of my friends are Islamic. You cannot imagine how hard it is, most of you, to be an Islamic person in America. how hard it is even to be an Islamic person here in Norwich. We are a discriminatory society. Does it still exist? Yeah. Now, the good news is, New York, I don't think these things happen here. I don't think this is as bad here. It's relative. Back to Ruth Benedict, cultural relativity. It's not as bad here as it is in Texas or Arkansas. But it's still here. Should we teach either critical race theory or patriotism in our schools? I would say no. I don't like either of them. I don't like the single narrative. I don't like case studies. I think critical race theory has some real holes in it if you try to teach it. I think the Trump view of patriotism is monumentally flawed for the same reason. So I don't think either one of them ought to be taught per se. What would I like to see? I won't say business as usual, but I think we get it right here most of the time as a former teacher, as somebody who kind of pays attention to the pedagogical issues that our state confronts with structuring curriculums. But I really like the policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It calls for the district to examine what they're doing. And then if it needs fixing, they fix it. But it does not dictate things to teach. It does not dictate how to teach. All right, so 52 minutes. I've talked fast. I've probably skipped over some things that you may be interested in. They're going to kick us out at 8:30, probably. So I'm available at this point for questions. Because we don't have a lot of time left, I would prefer a question rather than your view of something or a statement of principle or information about any of this stuff. So at this time, I'd open it for questions.
Could you just restate what you said about Andrew Johnson actually bringing in the free people from the African descent as opposed to Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, I don't know if Johnson, he was not an abolitionist. I don't know if he supported the aspirations of the Colonialization Society or not. Johnson wanted a different approach to Reconstruction. He espoused gradualism. Lincoln was dead. The radicals, they were